On the evening of September 21, 1854, 47 wedding guests witnessed what Salem's society would later call the most disturbing disappearance in Massachusetts history. Within an hour of cutting her wedding cake, 21-year-old Margaret Whitmore vanished from her own reception at the prestigious Hawthorne Manor, her silk wedding gown found abandoned in the estate's rose garden while her pearl necklace lay scattered across the cobblestone path. The bride's final words, overheard by the kitchen staff, were a panicked whisper to her new husband, "She's watching me from the shadows." What investigators discovered 3 days later would expose a web of maternal obsession so twisted that the Salem Register refused to print the complete details, fearing public hysteria. The person responsible had planned every detail for months, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Before we continue with the story of Constance Whitmore and the Ashford family tragedy, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which state or city you're listening from. Your engagement helps us bring these forgotten American mysteries to light. The truth behind what happened that autumn evening reveals a darkness that would forever change how Salem's elite viewed the bonds between mothers and sons. Salem in 1854 stood as one of New England's most prosperous ports, its harbor filled with merchant ships carrying exotic goods from the Orient and the Caribbean. The city's population had swelled to nearly 24,000 souls, with new money from shipping fortunes mixing uneasily with families whose wealth stretched back to the colonial era. Among Salem's most established names, none commanded greater respect than the Whitmores. Constance Whitmore, 52 years old and widowed for 8 years, ruled over one of Salem's most imposing households from her Georgian mansion on Chestnut Street. The 4-story brick edifice with its widow's walk and meticulously maintained gardens served as a monument to everything Salem's merchant princes represented: prosperity, refinement, and unshakable social authority. The house had been built by her late husband's grandfather in 1789, and every room contained treasures collected during decades of successful maritime trade. Constance had been born Constance Ashford, daughter of a moderately successful Boston silversmith. She had married considerably above her station when she wed Captain Jeremiah Whitmore in 1822. Jeremiah, heir to the Whitmore shipping empire, had chosen Constance for her striking beauty and sharp intelligence rather than her family connections. Their marriage had been passionate and devoted, though it scandalized some members of Salem society who felt the captain should have chosen a bride from an established merchant family. Their only child, Thomas, had been born in 1825 after 2 heartbreaking miscarriages that left Constance convinced he was a precious gift she must protect at all costs. She devoted herself entirely to his upbringing, ensuring he received the finest education available. Thomas attended Harvard College, where he studied literature and philosophy, returning to Salem in 1847 to manage the family's shipping interests and various investments in textile mills and railroad ventures. Tall and scholarly with his father's piercing blue eyes and his mother's refined features, Thomas Whitmore was considered Salem's most eligible bachelor. When Captain Jeremiah died of consumption in 1846, Constance found herself in control of an estate worth approximately $75,000, making her one of the wealthiest women in Massachusetts. She managed the family's complex business affairs with ruthless efficiency, determined to preserve not only their fortune but their social preeminence. The Irish potato famine had driven thousands of immigrants to Massachusetts throughout the late 1840s and early 1850s. These desperate families settled in Salem's North Shore district, crowded into tenements that lacked proper ventilation and sanitation. They worked for wages that established residents considered shamefully low, taking jobs in the city's expanding leather and textile factories. Their willingness to work for so little created resentment among American-born laborers and drove down wages across multiple industries. Constance observed these changes with growing unease. At meetings of the Salem Ladies' Benevolent Society, she listened to complaints about Irish servants who allegedly brought disease into respectable homes, about Irish children who disrupted the peace of proper neighborhoods, about Irish families who practiced their Catholic rituals with disturbing intensity. The established families of Salem began speaking of containment strategies, wondering whether these foreign Catholics could ever be properly assimilated into American society. Into this atmosphere of social tension came the Ashford family. In spring of 1853, Patrick Ashford, a widower of 41, had brought his 3 daughters to Salem after learning of employment opportunities in the city's thriving leather industry. His eldest daughter, Margaret, was 20 when they arrived, a beautiful young woman with raven black hair and violet eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and compassion that impressed everyone who met her. Patrick found work as a supervisor at the Naumkeag Steam Cotton Company, where his experience managing textile operations in County Cork proved invaluable. His salary allowed him to rent a comfortable house on Federal Street, in a neighborhood that was respectable if not fashionable. Margaret took a position as a music instructor for the daughters of Salem's middle-class families, where her skill at piano and her educated manner of speaking made her popular with both students and their mothers. It was at the Salem Athenaeum's monthly lecture series that Margaret first encountered Thomas Whitmore. The lecture, delivered by a visiting professor from Yale on the topic of American transcendentalism, had drawn Salem's intellectual community. Margaret attended because her employer, Mrs. Sarah Cabot, encouraged her Irish employees to pursue cultural education as a means of advancing their social position. Thomas noticed her immediately, seated in the section reserved for working people and their families. Margaret listened with an intensity that fascinated him, occasionally taking notes in a leather-bound journal. When the lecturer opened the floor for discussion, she raised her hand to ask about the influence of German idealism on American philosophical thought, a question so sophisticated that several audience members turned to stare at her in surprise. After the lecture, Thomas approached her as she gathered her shawl and journal. "That was a remarkably insightful question about German philosophy," he said, removing his hat. "I'm Thomas Whitmore. I don't believe we've been introduced." Margaret's cheeks colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Margaret Ashford, Mr. Whitmore. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." They walked together toward Federal Street, discussing Emerson and Thoreau with an intellectual rapport that surprised them both. Thomas learned that despite her limited formal schooling, Margaret had read extensively in philosophy, literature, and theology. She had learned German from a priest in Cork and continued her studies using books borrowed from Salem's various libraries and literary societies. When they reached the corner where their paths diverged, Thomas hesitated. "Miss Ashford, I wonder if you might be interested in attending next week's lecture? It's to be about the influence of European Romanticism on American poetry." Margaret's smile illuminated her entire face. "I would be honored, Mr. Whitmore." Their courtship developed slowly and carefully over the following months. Thomas understood the social implications of his interest in an Irish working woman, but Margaret's intelligence, grace, and genuine warmth convinced him that such considerations were narrow-minded and unworthy of consideration. They met for walks along Salem's waterfront, attended cultural events together, and discovered a compatibility that transcended their different backgrounds. For nearly 8 months, Constance remained unaware of these developments. Thomas had always been discreet about his personal affairs, and she assumed his frequent absences from home reflected his dedication to business matters or social obligations with other young men of his social class. The revelation came on a humid afternoon in August 1854, when Constance decided to surprise Thomas with a visit to his office at the Whitmore Building on Derby Street. As she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, she heard voices from behind his office door. Thomas's familiar voice and a woman's voice she didn't recognize, speaking with a slight Irish accent that made Constance's blood run cold. "My mother will never accept this," Thomas was saying. "But I don't care about her approval anymore, Margaret. I love you, and I'm going to marry you regardless of what anyone thinks." "Your family's position in society matters," the woman replied. "I don't want to be the cause of conflict between you and your mother. She sacrificed everything to preserve your inheritance after your father's death." "You don't understand," Thomas said firmly. "She's controlled every aspect of my life since father died. Whom I should court, where I should live, how I should conduct my business affairs. I'm 29 years old, and I've never made a single important decision without seeking her approval first. That ends now." Constance pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so violently she feared they might hear it through the door. "When will you tell her about our engagement?" the woman asked. "Tonight. I want her to meet you properly as my intended bride. She'll see what I see in you, your intelligence, your kindness, your strength of character. She'll have to accept that I've chosen the woman I want to spend my life with." The sound of chairs moving sent Constance fleeing down the stairs, her mind reeling with shock and rage. During the carriage ride home to Chestnut Street, her initial disbelief gave way to a fury so consuming that she felt physically ill. An Irish girl. Her Thomas, heir to the Whitmore fortune and name, was planning to marry an Irish Catholic immigrant. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed to preserve, would be destroyed by this nobody who had obviously seduced her innocent son with calculated charm and foreign wiles. That evening, Thomas came home for dinner appearing more cheerful than he had in months. Constance watched him carefully, noting the way he hummed under his breath while reading his correspondence, the satisfied smile that played at the corners of his mouth when he thought she wasn't looking. "You seem particularly content tonight, Thomas," she said, keeping her voice light. "Do I?" Well, I suppose I am. I've been thinking about making some significant changes in my life. Important changes that will affect my future happiness. What sort of changes? Thomas set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. Mother, I've met someone. A young woman of exceptional character and intelligence. I've asked her to marry me and she's accepted. Constance's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. How wonderful, dear. Anyone I know? No, but I'm eager for you to meet her. Her name is Margaret Ashford and she's... He paused, gathering courage. She's from Ireland originally. Her family came to Salem 2 years ago. The water glass slipped from Constance's fingers, shattering against the mahogany table. Oh, how clumsy of me, she said, rising to ring for the servants. You said Ashford? An Irish family? Yes. Her father works at the Naumkeag Company, and she teaches music to children from some of Salem's finest families. Mother, I know what you're thinking, but dash. I'm not thinking anything, Thomas, Constance interrupted, her voice carefully controlled. I'm simply surprised. You've never mentioned this young woman before. I wanted to be certain of my feelings before discussing her with you. But I am certain now. I love her, Mother, and we're to be married in September. Constance spent the remainder of the evening in her private sitting room, pacing the imported Persian carpet until she wore a visible path in its intricate pattern. Thomas's words echoed in her mind like a death knell. He loved this Irish girl and intended to marry her in less than a month. The implications struck her like physical blows to her body and spirit. Marriage to an Irish Catholic would destroy Thomas's social standing permanently. The best families in Salem would close their doors to him forever. His children would carry the stigma of mixed heritage, never fully accepted by established American society, yet rejected by the Irish community that would view them as traitors to their origins. More immediately threatening was the financial catastrophe that would follow. If Thomas married this girl, Constance would lose all influence over family affairs. As his wife, the Irish woman would have legal rights to the Whitmore fortune. She might convince Thomas to support her extended family in Ireland, to make donations to Catholic institutions, to invest in schemes that benefited Irish immigrants at the expense of established American interests. Constance had not clawed her way from middle-class Boston origins to the pinnacle of Salem society only to watch an Irish peasant destroy everything she had built through decades of careful social climbing and strategic financial management. Over the following days, Constance conducted a thorough investigation of the Ashford family. She learned that Patrick Ashford was considered reliable by his supervisors, but had attended meetings of Irish workers who were discussing the formation of labor associations. Margaret was well regarded by her students' families, but several society matrons whispered about the impropriety of an Irish girl presuming to educate the children of established American families. Most disturbing was the discovery that the Ashfords attended Mass at St. Mary's Catholic Church, the institution that many Protestant Salem residents viewed with suspicion and active hostility. The thought of her grandchildren being raised as Catholics, owing spiritual allegiance to a foreign pope, filled Constance with a terror so profound it left her unable to sleep. As the wedding date approached, Thomas's relationship with Margaret deepened into obvious devotion. He brought her to several public events, introducing her to his friends and business associates with obvious pride and affection. Constance watched from a distance as Salem society reacted with polite surprise that quickly gave way to whispered speculation and barely concealed disapproval. The breaking point came in early September when Thomas announced that he had reserved the Hawthorne Manor for their wedding reception. Margaret deserves the finest celebration Salem can provide, he told his mother over breakfast. I want everyone to see how proud I am to call her my wife. Constance set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. Thomas, I must ask you to reconsider this entire arrangement. Mother, please dash. Let me finish. I've said nothing about this association because I hoped it would end naturally. But you're talking about marriage now, about permanent commitments that will affect not just your life, but the future of our entire family legacy. Thomas's jaw tightened. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that marriage involves more than personal feelings. It's about social compatibility, shared values, common cultural backgrounds. This young woman may be perfectly pleasant, but she comes from a world entirely different from ours. The differences that seem charming during courtship become sources of bitter conflict in marriage. Her background doesn't matter to me. It should matter. It will matter to your children, who will struggle to find acceptance in proper society. It will matter to your business associates, who expect their partners to maintain certain social standards. It will matter to everyone whose opinion affects your future success and happiness. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm disappointed in you, Mother. I expected better from someone who married above her own station. Your father and I came from compatible circumstances. We understood each other's expectations and social obligations. This situation is entirely different. The only difference is your prejudice against Irish Catholics." Constance's mask of composure finally slipped. "It's not prejudice, Thomas. It's realistic concern about practical consequences. These people have different loyalties, different priorities, different ways of understanding the world. This girl will change you, and not for the better." "This conversation is over," Thomas said coldly. "I'm marrying Margaret in 2 weeks, with or without your blessing." After he left, Constance sat alone in the dining room for nearly an hour, staring at her untouched breakfast while her mind raced through possible strategies. Thomas would not be dissuaded by arguments, threats, or emotional appeals. He was determined to proceed with this disastrous marriage, and when he did, Constance's control over the family fortune and social position would end forever, unless she took decisive action to prevent it. The wedding of Thomas Whitmore to Margaret Ashford was announced in the Salem Register on September 8, 1854. The brief notice, placed prominently in the society section, generated more discussion than any social news in recent Salem memory. At tea parties and gentlemen's clubs throughout the city, people debated whether Thomas had lost his senses or simply fallen victim to Irish manipulation. Constance maintained a facade of gracious acceptance while privately developing her strategy. She attended social functions where well-meaning friends offered congratulations mixed with barely concealed sympathy. "How progressive of Thomas," they would say, their voices carrying unmistakable undertones of scandal. "I'm sure the girl is quite suitable." The worst humiliation came at a Ladies' Benevolent Society meeting where Mrs. Harrison Peabody, whose own humble origins were conveniently forgotten by Salem society, made pointed comments about maintaining proper standards in marriage. "Of course, we must show Christian charity toward these immigrant families," she said, glancing meaningfully at Constance. "But there are appropriate boundaries that shouldn't be crossed for the good of everyone involved." Constance smiled tightly and changed the subject, but the condescension burned in her chest like acid. She was being pitted and patronized by women who had once deferred to her social authority. The Whitmore name, which had opened every door in Massachusetts, was becoming a source of whispered gossip and snide commentary. During this period, Constance began studying Margaret Ashford with the intensity of a military commander examining enemy fortifications. She attended public events where the couple appeared, watching how Margaret moved, spoke, and interacted with Salem's elite. What she observed only deepened her alarm. Margaret was not the simple Irish peasant Constance had hoped to find. The young woman possessed natural elegance that couldn't be taught, intelligence that shone in every conversation, and genuine warmth that drew people to her despite their initial prejudices. Even some of Salem's harshest social critics admitted that the Ashford girl had remarkable poise for someone of her background. More troubling was the obvious depth of Thomas's devotion. He looked at Margaret with an adoration Constance had never seen from him before. When they walked together, he unconsciously adjusted his longer stride to match hers. When she spoke, he listened with complete attention. When others made subtle social slights, he defended her with fierce protectiveness that reminded Constance uncomfortably of how Captain Jeremiah had once defended her against similar treatment. The wedding was scheduled for September 21 at St. Mary's Catholic Church, followed by a reception at Hawthorne Manor. Thomas had wanted a small ceremony, but Margaret insisted on inviting both families and their friends. "I want everyone we care about to witness our vows," she told him. "I don't want anyone to think we're ashamed of our marriage or trying to hide it from society." Constance realized that a public wedding would complete her social humiliation. Every prominent family in Salem would attend, if only to satisfy their curiosity about the Irish bride. The ceremony would be discussed and analyzed for months, permanently cementing the Whitmore name's association with social degradation. As September progressed, Constance's desperation grew. She considered various strategies for disrupting the wedding plans. She could claim sudden illness, requiring Thomas to postpone the ceremony to care for her. She could attempt to bribe Patrick Ashford to withdraw his consent. She could threaten to disinherit Thomas entirely, cutting him off from the family fortune. But each option carried unacceptable risks. Thomas might proceed with the wedding regardless of her illness or financial threats. Attempting to bribe Margaret's father could backfire catastrophically if he revealed her offer to the wider community. And disinheriting Thomas would mean losing control over him permanently while ensuring that her carefully accumulated wealth eventually passed to strangers. The solution came to Constance during a sleepless night in mid-September. She was reviewing the household accounts when she remembered a conversation from the previous winter about problems with rats in the manor's wine cellar. The exterminator had left behind a supply of arsenic-based poison with detailed instructions about its properties and effects. The white powder dissolved easily in liquids, had virtually no taste when mixed with strong flavors, and produced symptoms that could mimic various natural ailments. Most importantly, arsenic was difficult to detect without sophisticated chemical analysis, procedures that were rarely performed in cases of sudden illness. Constance retrieved the container from the cellar storage room, her hands trembling as she read the warning labels. Here was a means of preventing Thomas's marriage that would appear entirely natural, tragic, but unavoidable. A sudden illness striking the bride during her wedding reception would be shocking but not unprecedented. Young women sometimes succumb to the excitement and stress of their wedding day, especially those from lower social classes who might be overwhelmed by the grandeur of high society celebrations. The plan crystallized with terrifying clarity. Constance would need to find an opportunity to administer the poison during the wedding reception when all attention was focused on the bride and groom. She would need to ensure that her own behavior appeared completely natural, that of a concerned mother-in-law witnessing an unexpected tragedy. On the morning of September 21st, Constance awoke with grim determination. Every detail of her plan had been rehearsed mentally dozens of times. She knew exactly when and how she would act, and the knowledge filled her with cold resolve. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock at St. Mary's Catholic Church, followed by a reception at Hawthorne Manor. Constance had volunteered to oversee the refreshment preparations, a responsibility that would give her complete access to the food and beverages being served to the wedding party. She dressed carefully in her finest burgundy silk gown, adding the diamond brooch Jeremiah had given her on their 10th anniversary. Her reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a woman of unshakable dignity, every inch the respected Salem matron attending her son's wedding. No one looking at her would suspect the deadly purpose that drove every calculated movement. The arsenic was concealed in a small silk pouch sewn into the inner lining of her reticule. The powder had been carefully measured the night before, ready to be dissolved in wine or punch at the crucial moment. Constance had practiced the motion dozens of times, ensuring she could empty the pouch's contents quickly and naturally while appearing to adjust the refreshment service. At noon, Constance arrived at Hawthorne Manor to supervise the final preparations. The elegant federal-style mansion, with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, had been decorated with late summer flowers in shades of cream and gold. Margaret's modest budget hadn't allowed for elaborate decorations, but the simple arrangements possessed understated beauty that even Constance grudgingly admired. She moved efficiently through the manor's reception rooms, checking flower arrangements and supervising the placement of tables and chairs. Her true focus, however, was on the refreshment service where wine and punch would be served to toast the new couple. The beverages were stored in the manor's pantry along with the wedding cake and other delicacies that would be served after the ceremony. At 1:30, guests began arriving from the church ceremony. Constance positioned herself near the manor's entrance, greeting each arrival with perfect social grace while internally seething at the spectacle. She watched Patrick Ashford escort his 2 younger daughters, noting how the family had obviously spent considerable money on new clothes for the occasion. Their evident pride in Margaret's marriage to a Whitmore stirred Constance's anger afresh. Members of Salem's elite arrived in elegant carriages, their expressions carefully neutral as they observed the mix of social classes represented among the guests. Constance noted their subtle reactions, the way they nodded politely to the Irish families while maintaining careful social distance. The dynamics she had predicted were already manifesting exactly as expected. At 2:30, Thomas and Margaret arrived from the church ceremony, both glowing with happiness. Margaret looked genuinely radiant in her simple white silk gown, her dark hair arranged with small white flowers, her violet eyes bright with joy. Thomas held her hand protectively as they moved through the reception, accepting congratulations from guests with obvious contentment. Constance felt a stab of genuine anguish watching her son's happiness, knowing she was about to destroy it forever. But the sight of Margaret wearing the Whitmore family pearls, Thomas's wedding gift to his bride, hardened her resolve. Those pearls had belonged to Constance's mother-in-law, passed down through generations of proper Whitmore wives. Seeing them around the neck of an Irish immigrant felt like desecration of everything the family represented. The reception proceeded with traditional formality. Guests enjoyed oysters from Plymouth Bay, roasted fowl, delicate pastries, and several types of wine carefully selected for the occasion. Constance moved through her duties as hostess with increasing tension, waiting for the moment when the formal toasts would begin. That moment came at 4 o'clock when Thomas called for everyone's attention. The guests gathered in the manor's main drawing room, crystal glasses filled with French wine in their hands, as Thomas prepared to toast his new bride. "My friends," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "Margaret and I are deeply grateful for your presence here today. Your attendance means more to us than you can possibly imagine." Constance positioned herself near the refreshment table, her hand moving casually to her reticule where the arsenic waited. This was her opportunity. While everyone's attention was focused on Thomas's speech, she could add the poison to Margaret's wine glass, which sat prominently on the table beside the wedding cake. "Margaret has brought light into my life," Thomas continued, his eyes fixed lovingly on his wife. "Her intelligence, kindness, and strength of character have made me a better man. I pledge to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of her love." The guests raised their glasses in approval while Constance's fingers found the silk pouch inside her reticule. With movements perfected through countless rehearsals, she moved closer to the refreshment table, ostensibly to refill her own wine glass. Margaret's crystal goblet sat unattended, half filled with dark red wine that would easily conceal the arsenic's presence. Constance glanced around quickly to ensure no one was watching, then emptied the poison into the glass and stirred it gently with a silver spoon. The white powder dissolved completely, leaving no visible trace. "And now," Thomas announced, "I ask you to join me in toasting the most beautiful, intelligent, and wonderful woman in Massachusetts, my wife, Margaret Whitmore." The guests responded with warm applause as Margaret stepped forward to accept her wine glass from the refreshment table. Constance watched with terrible fascination as Margaret lifted the poisoned wine toward her lips, her face glowing with happiness and gratitude. "Thank you all for sharing this perfect day with us," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Your kindness and acceptance mean everything to Thomas and me." She raised the glass in acknowledgement of the toast and took a deep sip of the poisoned wine. Constance held her breath, watching Margaret's face for any sign that she had detected the arsenic's presence. But Margaret showed no reaction other than continued joy as she took another sip and set the glass back on the table. The deadly dose had been consumed. Now it was simply a matter of waiting for the poison to take effect. The reception continued with conversations and laughter as guests enjoyed the refreshments and celebrated the new marriage. Constance joined various groups, making polite conversation while keeping Margaret under constant observation. According to her research, arsenic typically began affecting victims within 30 to 60 minutes of consumption. At first, Margaret appeared completely normal, moving gracefully from group to group with Thomas, accepting congratulations and engaging in animated discussions about their wedding trip to New York. Her appetite seemed healthy as she ate small portions of the wedding cake, and she showed no signs of the distress Constance expected to see. But as the afternoon progressed, subtle changes became apparent to Constance's watchful eyes. Margaret's face grew slightly paler, and she began touching her throat occasionally as if it felt uncomfortable. She declined offers of additional food, claiming she was too excited to eat, and her laughter seemed forced rather than spontaneous. At 5:30, nearly 90 minutes after consuming the poisoned wine, Margaret excused herself from a conversation with several society matrons, explaining that she needed a breath of fresh air. Thomas immediately offered to accompany her, but she insisted she wanted a few moments alone to process the overwhelming emotions of the day. "I'll just step into the garden for a moment," she told him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The roses are so beautiful this time of year." Constance watched Margaret leave the drawing room through the French doors that led to Hawthorne Manor's formal garden. This was the moment she had been waiting for, when the poison would finally claim its victim, far from the eyes of the wedding guests who would remember only Margaret's apparent happiness and perfect health during the reception. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Thomas began showing signs of concern when Margaret didn't return from the garden. "Perhaps I should check on her," he said to Constance. "She's been gone rather long for just a breath of air." "I'm sure she's fine, dear," Constance replied smoothly. Brides often need moments of solitude on their wedding day. All the attention can be overwhelming. But at the 20-minute mark, Thomas could no longer be dissuaded. "Something's wrong," he declared, moving toward the French doors. "Margaret would never leave our guests unattended for so long."